One of Vladimir Putin's most trusted advisors, Anton Kobiakov, recently made a striking declaration at an economic forum. He posited that the United States is engineering a plan to covertly devalue its immense $37 trillion national debt through the use of cryptocurrencies and stablecoins. As outlined by Kobiakov, the American strategy involves shifting this debt into a crypto cloud, which would then be leveraged to reset the global financial system, ultimately leaving other nations to absorb the fallout. Kobiakov, a senior advisor to Putin for more than a decade and a key architect of Russia's economic strategy, is a significant voice whose statements are considered to mirror the consensus within the highest echelons of the Russian government. While the concept of a crypto cloud may seem esoteric, the fundamental premise of Kobiakov's argument, that the United States is actively seeking to devalue its debt, is rooted in historical precedent. The U.S. has resorted to currency devaluation at several junctures in its history. It is this historical context that lends some credibility to Kobiakov's assertions, even if the specific mechanisms he describes may not be entirely precise. To fully grasp the current landscape, it is imperative to examine past instances of U.S. currency devaluation. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102 led to the confiscation of privately held gold. American citizens were compelled to sell their gold to the government at a rate of $20.67 per ounce. Subsequently, the government revalued gold to $35 an ounce, a move that resulted in an immediate devaluation of the dollar by approximately 69%. This decisive action substantially diminished the real value of the government's debt, simplifying its repayment. Another watershed moment occurred in 1971, when President Richard Nixon announced the suspension of the U.S. dollar's convertibility to gold. This decision, famously known as closing the gold window, marked the end of the Bretton Woods system and severed the dollar's final tie to gold. Since that time, the U.S. dollar has operated as a fiat currency, its value dictated by market dynamics and government policy rather than a tangible commodity. This has led to a persistent erosion of the dollar's purchasing power, with some analyses suggesting a loss of over 96% of its value since 1971. A more orchestrated devaluation took place in 1985 with the Plaza Accord. In a coordinated effort, the United States, France, West Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom agreed to depreciate the U.S. dollar relative to the Japanese yen and the German Deutschmark. This was a deliberate strategy to address the U.S. trade deficit. In the 2 years that followed, the dollar was devalued by roughly 25%. These historical precedents reveal a consistent pattern. In the face of substantial economic pressures, the U.S. has repeatedly utilized currency devaluation to manage its debt and bolster its economic position. The Russian leadership is undoubtedly aware of this history, which likely informs Kobyakov's recent statements. They perceive the current economic environment, with the U.S. national debt at unprecedented levels, as a harbinger of another significant monetary recalibration. However, the methodology for this potential new devaluation is where contemporary analysis departs from Russia's apparent interpretation. The notion that the U.S. will simply print digital dollars out of thin air is an oversimplification of the functionality of stablecoins and the intricacies of the modern financial system. The actual mechanism is more subtle and is already being set in motion through legislative action and the evolving architecture of the digital asset market. The key to deciphering the current situation lies in the expansion of the money supply, a contemporary form of devaluation. Since January 2020, the M2 money supply in the United States has swelled from approximately $15.5 trillion to over $21.9 trillion. This represents a 40% increase in just 4 years. When the money supply expands at such a breakneck pace without a commensurate increase in the production of goods and services, the value of each dollar diminishes. This is not merely a theoretical construct. Its consequences are tangible for consumers in their daily lives. During this same period, there have been significant price hikes across a broad spectrum of assets and consumer goods. The prices of gasoline and homes have both surged by about 50%. Property insurance has experienced an even more pronounced increase of 70%. The price of gold has climbed by 35%, and Bitcoin has seen an astronomical rise of over 250%. Even staple grocery items have not been spared, with the cost of products like steak, milk, and eggs increasing by 30% or more. This pervasive price inflation is, in effect, a devaluation of the dollar. A dollar today buys significantly less than it did just a few years ago. This devaluation has a direct bearing on the national debt. While the nominal value of the $37 trillion debt remains unchanged, its real value has been considerably eroded. In terms of purchasing power, the government's debt burden has been effectively reduced by approximately 40% without a single dollar of principal being repaid. This has been accomplished through the expansion of the money supply, a form of stealth devaluation. The challenge for the U.S. government is that the rest of the world is not oblivious to this strategy. Major holders of U.S. debt, including China and Japan, have been progressively reducing their holdings of U.S. treasuries. Foreign ownership of U.S. debt has declined from a peak of 34% to around 23%. This is a clear indication that foreign governments are losing faith in the long-term value of the dollar and are actively seeking to diversify their reserves. This scenario is reminiscent of the period preceding Nixon's closure of the gold window, when foreign governments began to redeem their dollars for gold at an accelerated rate. Confronted with a dwindling international appetite for its debt, the U.S. needs to cultivate new sources of demand. This is where stablecoins enter the equation. A piece of legislation, which has been dubbed the Genius Act, stipulates that all stablecoins must be backed by U.S. treasuries or cash. This creates a self-perpetuating, built-in demand for U.S. debt. Stablecoins such as USDT, Tether, and USDC, USD Coin, are digital currencies designed to maintain a stable value by being pegged to a fiat currency, in this case, the U.S. dollar. For every stablecoin issued, the issuer is obligated to hold an equivalent amount in reserves. Under the new legislative framework, these reserves must be held in the form of U.S. treasuries. This establishes a potent new channel for financing the U.S. government's debt. When an individual in a country with high inflation, such as Argentina, seeks to protect their savings, they might purchase USDT. When a business in Turkey wants to engage in transactions without exposure to the volatility of the Turkish lira, they might opt for USDC. In both instances, the dollars they use to acquire these stablecoins are then utilized by the stablecoin issuers to purchase U.S. treasuries. These individuals and businesses, often without their knowledge, become lenders to the U.S. government. The potential magnitude of this new demand is substantial. The current Treasury Secretary, Scott Bent, has projected that the stablecoin market could burgeon to $3.7 trillion by 2030. To provide some context, Tether and Circle, the two preeminent stablecoin issuers, currently hold a combined $182 billion in U.S. treasuries. This already positions them as the 18th largest holder of U.S. debt globally, surpassing countries like Germany and South Korea. If the stablecoin market expands to the projected $3.7 trillion, it will generate a massive and guaranteed stream of demand for U.S. debt, effectively supplanting the demand that is being lost from foreign central banks. The question then arises, where will the dollars to fuel this massive expansion of the stablecoin market originate? The answer lies in a pool of money that has remained largely dormant for over a decade: sterilized reserves. These are excess reserves held by U.S. banks at the Federal Reserve. At present, these reserves total approximately $3.2 trillion. This money was created during the era of quantitative easing that commenced in 2008, but it has been effectively sterilized, or kept out of the circulating money supply, to avert runaway inflation. Banks are paid interest on these excess reserves to incentivize them to keep the funds parked at the Fed. The Genius Act reportedly contains a provision that permits banks to use these excess reserves as backing for stablecoins. This is the linchpin for unlocking this vast pool of liquidity. A bank could take $1 billion of its excess reserves, which are currently yielding a low rate of interest, and use them to back $1 billion of a stablecoin. The money is not new. It is the same money that has been sitting at the Fed, but it is now being activated and injected into the global financial system. When this $3.2 trillion in sterilized reserves begins to circulate through the stablecoin market, it will exert significant inflationary pressure. The prices of goods and assets will continue to climb, and the value of the dollar will continue to decline. The $37 trillion national debt will be further devalued, not through the overt printing of new money, but through the activation of money that has been held in reserve. This is the more sophisticated and less understood mechanism that Russia may be overlooking in its analysis. It's not about creating more money, it's about unleashing what has been trapped. The rest of the world, particularly other central banks, are not oblivious to this impending devaluation. They are taking proactive measures to safeguard their interests. Gold, the traditional hedge against currency devaluation, has recently seen its price soar to an all-time high of $3,777 an ounce. Central banks globally have been acquiring gold at a pace unseen since 1967. For 4 consecutive years, central bank gold purchases have surpassed 1,000 tons. In 2022, central banks purchased 1,082 tons of gold, the highest level since 1967. This trend persisted in 2023 with 1,037 tons, and in 2024 with 1,045 tons. In 2025, central banks have already acquired 669 tons through the third quarter, putting them on a trajectory for another 1,000-ton year. The purchasers are a diverse cohort of countries, all seemingly united by the same objective: to reduce their exposure to the US dollar. Poland has been a significant buyer, acquiring 67 tons this year. The Czech Republic has been purchasing gold for 29 consecutive months, tripling its reserves since 2023. Turkey has been a consistent buyer for 26 straight months. And China has officially reported adding at least 36 tons of gold for 9 consecutive months, although the actual figure is likely much higher. These are not speculative investors. These are the most conservative financial institutions in the world. Their actions are a resounding indictment of the dollar's future and a clear indication that they foresee a major devaluation on the horizon. The discourse surrounding a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the United States has also been a subject of keen interest. However, Treasury Secretary Scott Bent has effectively quashed that speculation with his unequivocal statement, "No taxpayer dollars for Bitcoin." The notion of the U.S. government directly purchasing Bitcoin as a reserve asset appears to be off the table for the time being. However, this does not preclude the U.S. from accumulating a strategic Bitcoin reserve through indirect means. The government has a track record of fostering private sector innovation and then harnessing it for its own strategic purposes. For instance, private companies like SpaceX pioneered reusable rocket technology, which NASA now contracts for its missions. Amazon built a colossal cloud computing infrastructure, AWS, which is now utilized by the CIA and other government agencies. A similar dynamic may be at play with Bitcoin. The U.S. government may not be a direct purchaser of Bitcoin, but it is cultivating a regulatory environment where private companies and investment vehicles can amass it on a grand scale. Companies like MicroStrategy and Marathon, along with the numerous Bitcoin ETFs, are in effect constructing a strategic Bitcoin reserve that the government could potentially leverage in the future. In summation, Vladimir Putin's advisor, Anton Kobiakov, is astute in his assessment that the United States is on a trajectory to devalue its debt. However, the mechanism is not the simplistic printing of stablecoins that he envisions. It is a far more intricate process that entails the activation of sterilized reserves, the creation of a captive market for U.S. debt via stablecoin legislation, and the exportation of inflation to the rest of the world. This reset is not a future event to be debated. It is a process that is already in motion. The Genius Act is in place, the reserves are at the ready, and the mechanisms for their deployment are being finalized. The world's central banks are not blind to this reality, and their actions speak volumes. They are divesting from the dollar and gravitating towards hard assets like gold. For individuals, the ramifications are profound. Holding cash, U.S. dollars, or U.S. treasuries is a precarious proposition in this environment. The path to wealth preservation lies in holding hard assets that are insulated from government-led devaluation. Gold, Bitcoin, and other scarce assets such as certain minerals and real estate are poised to perform well as this monetary reset unfolds. The last major reset in 1971, which delinked the dollar from gold, saw the price of gold skyrocket from $35 an ounce to $800 an ounce, a 23-fold increase. Bitcoin has demonstrated the potential for even more dramatic appreciation in response to expansions in global liquidity. The stage is set for a significant devaluation of the U.S. dollar, and it is imperative to be positioned accordingly.